Tonight's event is a hosted and moderated roundtable discussion followed by an audience Q&A on the role of podcasts in sharing Micronesian history with local and global audiences. We will hear directly from a few of the people producing podcasts and radio shows about issues, events, and history in the region, as well as learn a bit more about the Memoirs Pasifika podcast and hear clips from some episodes. Tonight's sponsors. This event and the Memoirs Pasifika podcast are made possible through grants from Humanities Guam, the Northern Marianas Humanities Council, the Guam Council on the Arts and Humanities Agency, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Office of the Governor of Guam. And just a reminder that any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in Memoirs Pasifika episodes or this event do not necessarily represent those of the funders. Okay, joining us on the panel tonight is Dr. Michael Lujan Bevacqua, curator of the Guam Museum and a community scholar who specializes in CHamoru history and the teaching of the CHamoru language, the indigenous language of Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands. He is from the Cabeza and Bitot clans of Guahan. Bevacqua is also the host of the Fanatsu podcast, a decolonial current events and academic critique podcast based here in Guahan. He and his brother Jack have a creative company called The Guam Bus, which produces books, comics, and language materials focused on telling CHamoru stories and teaching the CHamoru language. We're also joined by Dr. Vivian Dames. She is a retired professor of social work and women and gender studies at the University of Guam with interest in community organizing, social justice, and social policy. She's been engaged in advocacy and community organizing related to social work and human services, as well as prison reform, land use, welfare and economic justice, militarization, and marriage equality. Dr. Dames previously served as director and host of Beyond the Fence, a weekly program that aired on KPRG, Public Radio Guam, featuring interviews and coverage of public events exploring the challenges of building community in places where U.S. military bases and installations are located. And last but not least is Tony Azios, the producer and host of Memoirs Pasifika. He is a documentary filmmaker, reporter, and multimedia producer. Tony has taught English as a first language in South Korea and the island of Ponape, as well as cinematography, photojournalism, and visual anthropology courses at the University of Guam. Tony earned an MFA in Film and Electronic Media from American University and a BA in International Studies and History from Manhattan College. Okay, if you have questions for anyone on the panel, or me for that matter, please type them into the chat bar. And toward the end of tonight's discussion, we'll have an audience Q&A session, and I will ask questions from among your submissions. And an important note before we get started, at the end of the event, we ask that everyone take a few minutes to complete a brief audience evaluation form. It will be sent as a Google form to the email address you used to register for this event. It's a fast and easy process, and it's very important for the organizations that are funding tonight's event and the Memoirs Pasifika podcast. Your feedback helps the organizations determine which programs to fund with grants, to ensure the public is engaged and benefiting from these programs, and to discover areas for improvement. So we thank you in advance for completing that. And if anyone out there is watching this as a group with folks who didn't register, we ask that you do. This certainly helps us get an accurate number of attendees and allows us to send you the form by email. We'll post a link to register in the chat section now. Okay. Panelists, are we ready to get started with tonight's discussion? Awesome. Okay, so we'll begin with Tony. Can you start us off by summarizing Memoirs Pasifika for any members of the audience who haven't had a chance to listen yet, and tell us about the podcast project, the podcast intent and goals?
Okay, unmuted. I'm probably going to do that a few times tonight. Bear with me. Yes, thank you so much, Manny. Okay, so Memoirs Pasifika is a documentary-style podcast that explores events, social movements, and people in modern Micronesia, including the Marianas Archipelago. And episodes range from about 20 minutes to almost 2 hours. Our most recent episode, where we had to release as a two-parter because it was almost 2 hours, but I think it's going to be fun to listen to that way. And in terms of the project's intent and goals, I guess that it's threefold. One, we want to help grow interest in the region foster discussion and inspire further investigation into events, people, and ideas that helped shape contemporary Micronesia. And when I say grow interest in the region, that's for a local audience and for an international, a global audience as well, who might not know so much about this really wonderful region. It's also to give a voice to the people who lived through and experienced the events that we're covering, and to give them a platform to share their experiences. And finally, to create a platform for historians, journalists, and other storytellers from Micronesia or who are deeply rooted in the region to provide accounts of different events.
All right, now Tony, you have a filmmaking and print journalism background. What inspired you to produce a podcast this time around, and why one that focuses on recent Micronesian history?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, so I have a documentary filmmaking background, and I love documentary films and documentary style podcasts. And one thing that I realized is that I have a lot of questions about people and events in this region, but I had trouble finding the type of media that I like to consume to learn about it. I mean, there's great stuff out there like Guampedia and books, but as somebody who kind of likes to listen, as I learned, I figured maybe a good thing to do would be to help fill, I don't want to say quite a void because there's a lot of good stuff out there, but one thing that I found is that, you know, especially with documentaries, is that a lot of them are very focused on World War II and don't often include local voices or give much context beyond the region as an important military asset, right? And I thought this was a great opportunity to try to get firsthand accounts and speak with folks who lived through these events who are from the region and try to broaden the scope of the narrative.
Now, as a settler to this region, someone who is not indigenous to the Marianas or any other part of Micronesia, what do you as a producer do to take steps in order to ensure that you are being responsible and ethical in the telling of another group's history?
It's definitely something that I try to keep in mind. I moved out here in 2016 and I had lived in Ponape for a year, several years prior. So yeah, definitely not from here and still learning a lot about the region and its history. But generally, you know, I just try to take a collaborative approach and really work hand in hand with local scholars and experts the whole way through at every step of the way, and give them a lot of, even though I'm producing, I try to give them as much latitude as they want and need to tell the story the way they want to tell it. So really I'm sort of playing in many ways sort of background role and playing a lot of a support role to help the anchors tell their stories well, and also to make our interviewees feel comfortable to share their stories, because I mean, it's so valuable what they're sharing, and they don't necessarily have a lot of reason to trust me. So I want to work with them and give them those reasons. But you know, one quick thing is also I try to keep in mind the colonial histories of my Mexican and Irish roots as well in telling the stories about this region, which is colonized. I try not to just repeat the history of the victors, right? Just to give the official narrative that of the empire's official history of a region, because when I read about Irish history and Mexican history, that's often what you encounter, and there's so much missing. There's so much context that could be there, and so I want to try to dig deeper and through these interviews speak with regular people and help sort of deconstruct the external factors that helped shape these events, and also tap into people's like internal monologues, how they felt during these events and what they were thinking and how they were reacting emotionally. Hope that answers that.
No, I appreciate that you tapped into those shared experiences of struggle and resistance in your own heritage. And yeah, I want to turn now to Miguet and Vivian. You've each served as anchors of multiple episodes of Memoirs Pasifika, and in addition, both of you have several years of experience hosting and producing either a podcast or radio show that examines political, cultural, and historical issues in Micronesia. But those shows, Fanatsu and Beyond the Fence, have very different formats from that of Memoirs Pasifika. Tell us more about your show's format and subject matters, then discuss the advantages of producing a free-flowing interview format show versus a highly edited and scripted documentary style program? What is gained or lost through these different approaches? And to kick us off, we'll turn to Vivian.
Half a day, and thank you, Manny. Beyond the Fence is a 1-hour pre-recorded program which aired weekly from 2010 to 2016 on Public Radio Guam KPRG 89.3 FM. Most of our episodes featured prepared interviews, recorded both in studio and in the field, sometimes under very interesting situations, with music relevant to the topic often woven in. Some of our episodes provided selected coverage of public events. Over this 5-year period, with some periodic breaks in production, the team produced 250 plus episodes that you could listen to on the air, via live stream, or download from iTunes. Some of the episodes were rebroadcast and updated. Each episode took about, we estimate about 20 plus hours in production work. And for most of this time, we relied primarily on the producer at KPRG for technical assistance. And eventually we created an internship for UOG students to assist with production. Detailed descriptions of each episode were sent out weekly via email to an eventual list of over 600 listeners. And then later, with the help of one of our UOG interns, we developed the logo and social media presence on Facebook and Instagram. As mentioned, I served as the director and anchor host of an initial team coordinating the work of 4 colleagues, all of whom were actively engaged in decolonization efforts and critiques of the military buildup in various ways. They were Michael Bevacqua, who's here on this panel, Lisa Linda Natividad, Victoria Lola Leon Guerrero, and Desiree Ventura Timinglow. Other individuals were over time invited to guest hosts. One thing that's important here is that we were all new to radio broadcasting. And get this, we were all volunteers with no external funding whatsoever. The inaugural episode was about the emergent organization We Are Guahan, which took the lead at the time to educate our community about what was contained in the lengthy 2009 draft environmental impact statement released by the US Navy outlining the plans for the relocation of US Marines from Okinawa to Guam. Educating the community and encouraging participation in responding to this DEIS and other plans for increased military activities was a central focus of the program, eventually expanding to discuss beyond the fence issues in other locations in the region and broader issues. What was gained from using this format? Well, first of all, immediate access to a public radio audience in Guam and the Northern Marianas, and eventual listing as an NPR program. We had the immediate technical support and access to a studio and equipment for recording and production. So from the time we got acceptance of our proposal from KPRG, we hit the ground running and began producing. We had dynamic flexibility to respond to what was happening at the time, and incredible richness in terms of the contributions and resources that the diverse hosts and guests brought to this program. What was lost is that we didn't reach people who weren't listening to public radio. And the quality of production was uneven, depending on each host and the extent of collaboration with the staff or intern who was doing the technical editing. We were also sometimes constrained by KPRG policy and having to dance sometimes around the distinction between doing community education and doing advocacy. And finally, scheduled airtime could be preempted by other NPR live coverage.
We get, with podcasts, it's obviously, it's quite different from public radio. And tell us a little bit more about the show Fanatsu. And again, what is gained or lost in this different approach to media?
Again, well, Sidus Masi, Manny and Tony and everybody else for having me on. Manny, you can talk about the start of Fanatsu because you started Fanatsu. And so it's interesting because Dikiki Natanu, small island and small sort of media networks here on island. And so we've all collaborated, we've all worked together. But so Fanatsu started through independent Wahan. Sort of Manny Cruz was a graduate student who was working and collaborating, a member of Independent Wahan, and sort of podcasts were becoming more and more popular at that time. And so Manny wanted to try it out for Independent Wahan. And of course, Independent Wahan is an all volunteer organization. And so whatever the capacity that people bring to it, that's what it can do. And so because of that, Fanatsu there was always sort of this, that in doing these types of community projects, there's always goals and hopes for a certain level of quality for that, we could do this or we could do that, or this would be amazing. But that is always sort of balanced with the realities of the fact that that people have families, people have jobs. And so if something like your podcast sort of is lower on the list of the things that you need to take care of each week, then it's hard. It's hard to come up with something, similar to like Memoirs Pasifika, in which you bring together long interviews and edit them together and produce it in that sort of quality. And so Fanatsu's focus has always been on sort of putting out content there, but also making so that it isn't too arduous on the people who make it, right? So that's why the single interview subject, single interviewer, or sort of one take, one shot approach to interviewing is always the easiest. Because if you can sort of get it all together in one go, if no one has to edit it, if no one has to look at it afterwards, then you can get it out right away. And for community groups, a lot of times it's that sort of specialized work, which it's hardest to find people to do, right? Because like as a community group, you may be able to do a lot of interviews with people who are willing to talk about the issues that are important to them. You may be able to get a lot of great video of events, things that are happening in the community. But who has the time to sit for 8 to 10 hours and then edit that into something, right? It's harder to find those people, right? And so Fanatsu was really started sort of in the Tadza Salapi, Tadza Chempo, Tailugat, the sort of no money, no time style of podcasting, right? Which is that there's something in the community, we're all volunteers. What can we do to sort of speak on this, to have something that has an impact, but we still have to do it within our capacity, within our ability and our time. So because of that, so you ran Fanatsu for a while before you left to go start your PhD program. And then after that, Lawrence Sigwenzama Lizama, he was the one that continued it, producing it for a while. And then at the start of the pandemic, then I started sort of producing it. And for me, sort of Zoom has been sort of the savior for Fanatsu, because we always struggled in Fanatsu with using different broadcasting platforms, different software in order to try to integrate things. One of the great things about Zoom is that it's easy to live stream, it's easy to record, it's easy to include the sharing of images or video into sort of an episode. And so, Fanatsu is, at this point, Fanatsu is something that I do every week to kind of have the conversations with people that I want to have, to talk about some of the issues that I think are important. And every week, sort of, it creates sort of like it's adding into sort of the memory of these sorts of things. It's adding to our memory of things, because even as we have this ability to record so much and document so much, it doesn't mean that everything gets saved. So for example, people nowadays realize that just because your phone and Facebook can remember so many things for you, it doesn't mean that your phone sat down and interviewed your grandfather about his life, right? Just because Google can answer so many questions, Spotify or Amazon Music, Alexa can pick your favorite song that you want in any given moment, it doesn't mean that they get to sit down and listen to your grandmother talk about the songs that she heard when she was young, or the stories that she heard from her elders, right? And so for me, part of Fanatsu is that whenever there's things happening in the community, or if somebody comes across my path, my digital path or my physical path, where I feel like, oh my goodness, you know what, I should sit down and talk to you and you should share your story. Because as I've experienced sometimes, people that I've sat and talked to in oral history interviews, sometimes the family sort of comes back to me asking, oh, can you share what you got from our father, because he never talked to us about those sorts of things, right? And so that's, for me, one of the ways that Fanatsu sort of serves a community purpose. And why when people suggest episodes, if somebody feels like, you know, you should document this, you should find somebody to talk about this, I'm always open, because I love that organic community-based sort of framework for how it works. And so, yeah, so Fanatsu, Tadza Salape Tailugat, Nobula Tiningu, lots of knowledge, not a lot of money, not a lot of time.
You know, I love that you mentioned the Tailugat. That brings back fond memories of finding a place to hold the podcast, right? So I remember lugging the microphones and the laptop and trying to find a place to sit down to actually record a podcast. And again, I think that's what's so special about what it is what you're doing with Fanatsu and what Fanatsu is. Because in a sense, we are creating these places to hold these conversations. And I especially love what you're doing with Zoom and all the blessings that technology has to offer us, allowing us to connect with people in different locations across Oceania and the world. So now we are going to dig deeper into the role of your shows and others, and play in telling Micronesian history and sharing Pacific Islander perspectives. But first, we're going to get a better understanding of how Memoirs Pasifika does these things by hearing about what topics your episodes cover, getting some behind-the-scenes stories or insights into your process, and then hearing a few clips. So, Maget, let's begin with you this time. Tell us about the episodes that you anchored, why you selected those topics, and something interesting or surprising you learned during your interviews and research.
All right, and so there's technically three episodes that I've had the honor of producing for Memoirs Pasifika. The first one was focused on Governor Carlos Camacho's 1969 trip to Vietnam to visit the CHamoru troops who were there. And then the second and third are about the CHamoru revival of seafaring. So the contemporary attempts by Chamorros to sort of regain, reconnect, you know, find again their roots as seafarers and navigators, and working and learning from other Micronesian islands that have sort of kept that knowledge alive. And so I know we're going to listen to the episodes, right? We're going to listen to pieces of them, right?
Yes, we do have clips for our audience. Yeah.
The first clip comes from the Carlos Camacho episode, and it is of Carlos Camacho, Governor Camacho's daughter, current Senator Mary Torres, talking about. Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead. And she's talking about when her father told the family that he was going to go to Vietnam, and he was the first sort of governor during the Vietnam era from the US and its territories to travel into an area that was an active war zone where the US was actively at war. So go ahead, put for what.
But the one memory that I do have that just grips me to this day is The night that before he was leaving, I was asleep already and I heard rustling, right? So I woke up and the light was on in the hallway and I made my way to my parents' bedroom. And I stood there in the doorway, the door was open, and I saw my father embracing my mother, and she was sobbing uncontrollably, her head in his shoulder, just sobbing and sobbing. And that scared me so much because I realized that something was wrong. And I didn't interrupt them, but I just remember going back into my room and crying. And I thought, what's going on? You know, what does this mean?
So yes, for me, the Governor Camacho episode, one of the things that I really enjoyed about that was that we interviewed men, mainly men, a soldier that was there in Vietnam that met with the governor, two of his aides who were working for him at that time. And then, they told things sort of by the book, but, they told it in very restrained ways. But then when we talked to Camacho's daughter, Mary Torres, about her feelings, she reiterated some of the same points, but she also offered sort of some vulnerability and some emotion sort of in it, that a lot of the other interview subjects were very by the book. It was super dry, and all of them were military veterans, interestingly enough. So the way that they told the story was very straightforward, right? You asked them, what was the food like? Because they barbecued for the governor, and they say stuff like, well, there was ribs and there was rice. And it's kind of like, oh, you don't wanna hype that up a little bit. There was lots of rice, there was lots of ribs, and so the episode was definitely missing something, right? Because part of what made this impressive was, that Governor Camacho didn't have to do this. Governors weren't doing this at that time. No one was going to Vietnam to visit their troops, but he chose to do it. Now, he may have chosen to do it because it was a politically fantastic thing to do, right? He may have chosen to do it because he felt that, the boys in Guam are struggling, they're dying, we need to support them, we need to be there for them. But he did it before anyone else did it. And the military acknowledged that by their recollection, no other governor had done something like this before in the Vietnam conflict. And so it was important then that sort of Senator Torres bring in that dimension, that he was taking a risk. Now, he wasn't taking the same risks that the soldiers were, of course, but by going there, he was putting himself in harm's way to basically bring the spirit of home to these troops, to share the CHamoru spirit with them, right? And one of the things that everybody acknowledged is that the boys from Guam were very happy, but the boys from every other state and territory were kind of irked, because the boys from Guam were like, oh, our governor's here. He's brought us.
I think we lost Miguel again, hopefully momentarily. But I will say very briefly that
he's brought us.
Oh, there he
you
is.
want some good white and patriotic, and think they are all basically saying, oh shoot, can you hear me? Sorry, my connection might have cut out. They are all basically looking and saying, why is my governor not visiting me? Everyone talks about supporting the troops. Why are they not here with us, right? Why are they not here? Why is it that your governor is doing this for you? And so there's a lot of emotions involved in this. And Senator Torres's story highlights that fact, that, that he was taking a big risk. Now it's very common. Now lots of politicians go to Afghanistan, to Iraq, and so on for stuff like this. It's normal. But we have to always remember that it was a governor from Guam who was the first to do something like this.
For sure. Definitely. One thing I was about to say was just how much it struck me that throughout even our contemporary history, how our people have done such great things, unprecedented things, such as what Senator Torres shared with us on that episode. And speaking of great things, the next clip we have is from the revival of traditional seafaring in the Marianas episode. And so can you talk a little bit about that?
And so for this episode, I really wanted to do this episode just because For me, I really wish that I could sail in a traditional canoe. I would really love it if there was a voyage to Pagan and they had an extra seat for somebody who is useless and gets seasick easily and won't contribute much except weighs about 20 pounds more because of the pandemic than usual, that I could jump onto that canoe and go with them, right? My heart is there, the body, the constitution, not so much. So I always want to connect to seafaring, to navigation, because it's one of the great things that our people once did. And for me, listening to the stories of those who are trying to revive it, it's inspiring for me. And I want more people to understand. I want more people to understand this. And so one of the great things about this, though, is that it's created another opportunity for Chamorros to connect to other islanders in Micronesia, right? That this is not just a Chamorro story, but this is a story of Chamorros finding their way back to connect to the other islanders, which a lot of Chamorros sadly feel that we are superior to in different ways, right? That we're not all islanders, we're not all from the same, you know, coconut tree islands, lemai eating cultures, canoe, seafaring, right? And so that's why, so for this excerpt, the focus is on Larry Regetaw, who is a master navigator from the island of Lamotrec. In the 1970s, when Larry was a child, the carving and sailing of canoes was still a central aspect of life on his island.
From very early age, I was introduced into becoming a seafarer in the years when seafaring was pretty much all that we were brought up to be. You're down at the canoe hut and the men will be giving you the lessons and telling you, oh, you should have done it this way or you should have done it that way. Of course, even prior to that, we learn. So here we're carving the model canoes, and boys would just kind of race those model canoes, which is it's like a sport. You know, the more you sail your own model canoe, the more you're also interested to even carve one that might even be faster or bigger. And then there's all other kinds of activities. If you're not in the water, you're doing something else in the canoe house where the men are carving a canoe or where the men are carving something else, working on a project. And you would find little boys my age at that time to be also hanging around and watching and listening to stories by the old men is like the best thing you could do in a canoe house.
Lamotrec and Puluwat are just two of several hundred tiny islands spread far across Micronesia that are collectively known as the Caroline Islands. To understand how these Carolinian master navigators would help revive traditional seafaring with the Chamorros to their north, we need to rewind to when Rob Lim Tiako was still a student at Western State University. Oh, that's good. That's good for that clip, Sidus Masi. And so what I want to highlight about that, though, is because you know, one thing that I really like to emphasize, and Master Larry in his interviews, he really highlighted it well. You don't necessarily need to keep alive traditional navigation in Micronesia because we want to stay in the past. You keep it alive because it's built on profound wisdom, critical skills, right? A rootedness, right? And the knowledge can change. The world around us can change. But ultimately, when you're talking about navigators of the past, you're talking about individuals who were very well in tune with their environment, who could read the signs of the world around them, who had incredible memories, who had incredible courage. And so when you're thinking about, well, how do we educate youth today to be stronger, to be smarter, right? I mean, we could just sort of let whatever 9 videos they watch next on YouTube do it for us, or we could let whatever Netflix recommends to them, right? We could let those things raise our kids. We could just follow the American example for whatever gets taught in the classrooms. But for me, what I liked about this episode is it reminds us that within the cultures of Micronesia, there are all these powerful ways of reaching and teaching youth. And navigation can be one of them, right? The canoe house, the canoe, the stars, right? The chants, the songs, all of these can be adapted and brought into the contemporary moment to fit into our educational system, to fit into our life today. And so I think a lot of times, and so I'm glad that more and more people are understanding this, that when we talk about canoe culture, these sorts of things, it's not solely about connecting to the past, but it's also about understanding that there was strength and power in that part of our culture. And what can we do to harness it today, to use it today so that we have children, so that we have youth who are grounded, you know, who are grounded in the world, and sort of not just kind of floating on, not just kind of floating on. And so that's what I like about that episode.
For sure, not floating on, but truly navigating, right? I like that. Vivian, same questions for you now. Please tell us about the episodes you anchored, why you selected these topics, and something interesting or surprising you learned during your interviews and research.
Okay, thank you. I hosted episode 2, which was about Cecilia Cruz Bomba, Guam's champion for land claims and war reparations. And I came upon that as a focus because I was looking for an episode that would be in recognition of both Women's History Month and CHamoru Month. And I remember reading the book, Daughters of the Island, Contemporary Women Organizers on Guam by Dr. Laura Marie Torres Sauder. And in that book, she devoted a chapter to Mrs. Bomba. And I remember reading this one part in that case study where she talked about how Mrs. Bomba was the first CHamoru woman to appear before Congress on a major policy issue specific to Guam. And that was in June 15th, 1977, when she was representing roughly 1,000 landowners seeking fair compensation for land taken from 1944 to 1963 for the post-World War II military buildup of the island at that time. I mean, Mrs. Bomba, or Chilang, she was affectionately called, was just an amazing, remarkable woman. And I just was very taken with this moment of how did this woman, in the context that she was in, what was surrounding the swirl of events that brought her to that moment of being this first CHamoru woman to speak to Congress on an issue. And so I've got a couple of clips I want to share with you from that episode. And this is a clip with clips from my interview with Laura Sauder.
In 1976, Mrs. Bomba traveled village to village in Guam, documenting the stories of land claimants. Dr. Sauder was among the cadre of young women recruited as volunteers to complete this daunting task.
That was during the time when we didn't readily have tape recorders, we couldn't use phones or anything like that, right? So we literally hand wrote these testimonies. A very laborious job. And very often we were handwriting what the claimants were saying in the way they were saying it, mostly in CHamoru. And then we had the job of translating and summarizing these testimonies. It was a very labor-intensive effort.
Organizing the Guam Landowners Association and collecting the testimonies of so many land claimants was not only challenging, it was highly controversial.
You know, she was part of that generation that came out of the war where the military saved Guam. And so she was very pro-American in that respect. And this confused a lot of activists because those who spoke on behalf of the federal government were not viewed as ideally suited to speak against the federal government or what the federal policy was. And yet it was because of the way that she presented herself as a loyal American, I think, that got her into some of the senatorial offices to make the case. So Viv, it was a very conflicting time, because one generation of Chamorros viewed reality in a very different way than the earlier generations did. And so there was a lot of locking horns, if you will, on issues related to land claims when it first started. But slowly and patiently, she went around the island and explained to landowners what was going on, and that she was trying to advocate for their rights to get proper compensation for the lands that had been taken away. And she was able to foster the establishment of the Guam Landowners Association. I was young at the time, in my 20s, but I remember how contentious that was in the community. And yet she kept plowing on. There's one thing that is clear about Chilang Bomba. She was not a quitter.
Powerful. Now,
I love these clips, and let me talk about each of them. First of all, I love the clip when she talks about what was involved in that very first stage of collecting the stories regarding land claims. This was before the digital age. I mean, imagine going village to village, listening to stories, handwriting them, many of them Chamorro, and then having to transcribe. It was incredible. And I think it's important in this moment to be reminded of the kind of labor that was required to do organizing and documenting of stories, like this effort was. The other thing I like about this piece is that, Mrs. Bomba was a lot of things, but what I learned in the interview was that she was also Laura's mentor. She was a family friend. She also became a mentor, and then, of course, later is the subject of Laura's research. And then the second piece is, I think, really important because, I learned the extent to which Mrs. Bomba was really caught in this critical moment of change. We were still coming out of that assimilist, we want to be Americans, we want to be equal, but then this was emerging a very different discourse, a very different way of thinking about representing the people of Guam, not in terms of individual rights within the American system, but a people, a nation with human rights and sovereignty. I mean, that was a whole different way of thinking. And for her to be caught right in the midst of this critical change, and to have the courage and the stamina, despite being the mother of 10, despite dealing with her own illness, to go to Congress and put the issues of land claims and war reparations on, as Laura put it, the federal radar, was just amazing. So I love these pieces, and I'm happy to share with you.
Yes, and of course, Dr. Sauder is joining us in the audience this evening. Afade Saina. Now, Vivian, take us to episode 5, Marriage Equality and LGBTQ Rights on Guam.
This aired in June, and I wanted to do something related to marriage equality, but it ended up morphing into something much more than that, to place the campaign for marriage equality within the larger sort of landscape of the LGBTQ movement on Guam. And my focal point was the fact that on June 9th, 2015, Guam became the first territory to legally recognize same-sex marriage. So in this episode, I do interviews with those sort of key people who were involved in the campaign for marriage equality and played a role in that movement, and how the movement gained momentum, the failed attempts in 2009 to legislate the same-sex marriage, and then the eventual legal victory here in Guam, which interestingly preceded the US Supreme Court decision by 2 weeks. And then we also talk about current issues regarding LGBTQ rights and opportunities today. So I have a clip to share with you in my interview with BJ Cruz, Benjamin Cruz, who is widely recognized as being a pioneer and trailblazer in terms of the LGBTQ movement in Guam.
In 1995, Cruz and his partner of 10 years, Jimmy Applegate, were featured in Laddie magazine for an article titled Living Gay on Guam. In the cover photo, they embraced while happily, confidently smiling. But at this point, many LGBTQ people on Guam were still not out for fear of social and career repercussions. Those who were out tended not to speak publicly about their sexual orientation. So the magazine cover garnered a great deal of attention, both positive and negative. Cruz spoke to me about why he chose to do this magazine article.
I had been in family court, and I knew that there were kids that were having problems with their parents about their being gay. And I knew that there were lots of young people that I was meeting at the bars that were having problems about what they were going to do about their homosexuality. And I wanted to prove to them, you can be whatever you want to be. You can be a lawyer, now you can be a judge. You can love somebody. And that was the reason why I agreed to have that article with Johnny, to have others see that. When that article came out, I had calls from lots of school teachers who thanked me. They said, you don't know how much that helped with kids in our classes, that they were able to come to me and then be able to open up about the fact that they were gay because they saw that a successful man was gay and that a successful man was in a committed relationship with another man.
This episode was an incredibly ambitious episode to try to capture the depth, the complexity of all that was happening. And I decided to share this piece because, you know, I remember when that Laddie magazine article came out. I remember that cover photo. I remember being absolutely thrilled that I had this local publication that I could use in the classroom. And I saw just how much it stimulated. It opened up discussions in ways that other materials did not. And in this episode, it's very easy to kind of get lost in the complexity of the legalities and all the different players that were involved. But throughout the episode, you have moments like this moment where fundamentally the movement was about the struggle to be allowed to live an authentic life, to not be in hiding, to not have to apologize. And I think it also, for me, brought up the issues which I've had to deal with in all of my interviews, with how you deal with sensitive material. You know, what's included in my interview in the episode with BJ Cruz is about maybe 15% of the material that was actually collected and recorded. And I think when you are presenting people's stories and in their own words, you still have this editorial responsibility, not only to be true to the narrative that they want to present, not the one you want to present, but the one that they want to present. And to do it in a way that's not exploitive and yet brings people to the feelings of the person who's telling the story. And every time that happens in an interview, for me, it's like the sacred moment, really. I mean, it's like, it's so special, and you feel this tremendous responsibility to do right by their honesty and their courage.
I appreciate that. There's something very sacred about the interviewing process, you know, certainly for people in the Pacific. And so now I want to take us back to our producer, Tony. So Memoirs Pasifika is described as a podcast about recent Micronesian history, and yet all of the episodes in season 1 focus on Guam or the CNMI. So can you explain why the Mariana Islands take center stage while Palau, FSM, and the Marshall Islands aren't featured?
Yes, in a word, COVID. We actually had a decent budget in order to go and fly out to FSM, fly out to Palau, maybe even the Marshalls to do some reporting, do some recording of interviews. But as probably most of the people listening in right now are very aware of, these islands were some of the most locked down places on Earth for much of the last year and a half. And I was lucky enough to collaborate with folks in Saipan, but it was really hard, actually. The logistics of not being able to be there with folks, partake in the interviews, record the media myself, and be able to drop it onto my computer right away. It became a bit cumbersome, and so trying to coordinate that to a Koshrai or Chuk or something would have been very, very hard. So yeah, best laid plans, right? The intent was to be more inclusive than we were for this have been for this first season. That said, there are 2 episodes in which we do get to include a bit more history from some of these nations. So we'll speak a little bit later, I hope, about the episode about the crafting of the covenant in the CNMI, and so in that episode we do talk a bit about the history of the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands, the TTPI, and so we do get a bit of context about what was happening in the region at that point. Although, yes, that episode is a bit more focused on the Northern Mariana Islands. Likewise, in the episode that we just heard a clip from Miget, from Dr. Bevacqua, about the revival of traditional navigation, we get to hear from a Carolinian navigator, and we get to hear quite a bit about the history of those islands. So, we in the ways that we could, we tried to have a bit more of a Micronesian perspective.
Speaking of the TTPI, my next question, because of some of the time constraints around tonight's event, there are some people who played an active role in Memoirs Pasifika who couldn't join us this evening, such as former Saipan Congressman L.J. Castro and Dr. Evan Lea Spiritu Gandhi. Can you talk to us a little bit about the topics that they produced episodes for, and some of the creative choices as well that you made as a producer and editor?
Yes, happy to do so. And in fact, LJ Castro is in attendance today. He was able to make it, so he's listening in. If we have time towards the end, during the Q&A session, maybe somebody will have a question for him, and I'm going to put him on the spot and just volunteer him right now. Sorry, LJ. But yeah, so I'll talk first about Operation New Life, an episode anchored by Dr. Espiritu Gandhi. She's an associate professor of Asian American Studies at UCLA, and she has a very personal connection to this story in the sense that she's the daughter of her mother and grandmother were both refugees that came through Guam from South Vietnam during Operation New Life. And so not only is this a major part of her area of research, her doctoral research was carried out in part on Guam, where she interviewed a number of people involved in Operation New Life, especially CHamoru's. She has that personal connection that really sort of helps, I think, bring the story to life in many senses. One sense that she interviews her grandmother as part of the episode, and so that helps kind of bring some emotion and the reality, that a sense of the impacts that this event had in future generations. So for those of you out there who are unaware, Operation New Life in a nutshell was immediately during and after the fall of Saigon, there was a massive humanitarian effort to get a lot of people out of South Vietnam, especially people who were likely to face political persecution. And Guam, over the course of about 4.5 months, hosted 112,000 refugees. Pretty wild. And so this episode talks about that period. And so I guess the part of your question about creative choices I made as the producer, I love archival audio, I love archival footage, and if I'm ever working on a film or now this podcast in which I can incorporate a bit of history into it and give us that texture of how it looked, how it felt and sounded at that point, I want to do so. So let's play a clip from Operation New Life that gives a good sense of how I was able to locate some archival audio that can hopefully help transport the listener a bit in telling the story. I'm hearing from our producer that we're having some technical difficulties, so stand by.
In Saigon, the tensions had reached a fever pitch.
Heavy shelling at the airport destroys planes on the ground, and American Marines are killed by rocket fire.
We are seeing a great human tragedy as untold numbers of Vietnamese flee the North Vietnamese onslaught.
With communist forces only a few miles from the center of Saigon, the order to evacuate is given.
Throughout the war in Vietnam, the U.S. Air Force and Naval Base on Guam played a key role in supporting the American military intervention in Southeast Asia. But in April of 1975, as North Vietnamese forces advanced upon Saigon, it was clear that the war's end was fast approaching, and that supporters of the American-backed regime who remained in South Vietnam would face brutal reprisals. Despite being located 2,500 miles away, this turn of events would have unexpected results for Guam.
We have now decided on Guam as a staging area, and we are moving people directly from Saigon to Guam.
Over the next 4 months, the tiny island of only 93,000 people would play a new and even more pivotal role in the conflict, this time in processing roughly 112,000 refugees fleeing political persecution and the fall of their beloved homeland.
This was a topic in which there was actually quite a bit of surviving video footage and audio, whereas some of the other topics that we covered in different episodes, in particular, the one about Cecilia Bomba, it was really hard to find surviving video footage and audio recordings. So when and where we can, we try to incorporate that in, and hopefully that's something that the audience is also enjoying, to sort of hear how people were talking about it in the moment at that time. Let's see. I'm going to play one more clip from this episode, because I think such a valuable thing, not just about Memoirs Pasifika, but about the whole process of documenting people's stories, their oral histories, their memoirs in general, is the surprising ways in which it can be beneficial to people in the future. We got to hear from 2 people in this episode who had actually died before Memoirs Pasifika was even a thing. And that was because Dr. Spiritu Gandhi had been out here years prior interviewing folks. And now at that point, she had no intention of it ever being part of a podcast. It was just for her notes when she was doing her doctoral research. And she just had a little handheld digital recorder, but she held onto those files. And so we get to hear from Joaquin Quin Perez, who died in 2019, and Monsignor David Quirigua, who also passed in 2020. But because she had documented their stories, we get to hear a bit from them in this episode. And it also has value besides just the sharing of history. When we reached out to Quin Perez's family to ask permission to use the clip, they were thrilled to find out that this existed, and the family said, please share the whole interview with us. We miss him so much, we'd love to hear his voice. And they had the whole family gathered around to listen to it. So there's surprising ways in which documenting people's stories can really be valuable. But let's play clip 6 in which we'll get to hear from Kin Perez.
As the commercial port director during Operation New Life, part of Kin Perez's job was to work with the U.S. Navy to identify which of the incoming ships carrying Vietnamese evacuees were no longer seaworthy. Many vessels were intentionally sunk in the Marianas Trench. However, Perez recalls how one young captain refused to abandon her ship.
One of them belonged to a young lady, and she captained the ship from Vietnam to here. And when we tried to evacuate her from the ship, she refused to go because that ship was given to her by her parents. She tied herself to the mast, and when the security tried to take her off, she opened up her dress, her jacket, and she had hand grenades tied around her. And right then I gave the order, I want my men off of this ship until you guys in the military figure out what you're going to do with this young lady. They brought in a couple of interpreters, and they finally talked her, to come loose and to get that armament off of her. And they took her over to the camp. We explained to her why the ship was not seaworthy anymore. And I think the U.S. government agreed to compensate her something for destroying the vessel.
Okay, unmuted. Yeah, so I think that just is a tiny little slice of just an interesting the sub events that happen in these larger events, and something that we would never have heard of if we were reaching out to speak with the folks who experienced these events firsthand, and you get to hear his emotion experiencing that and seeing somebody with grenades strapped to them, and sort of the panic to evacuate the ship quickly. But there's so much is covered in that episode, and I'm just so glad that we were able to also get to hear from people who have passed. Now, next, I'll talk about that episode by L.J. Castro. It's called Crafting a Covenant, the Founding of the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. So L.J. Castro is a former congressman in the Northern Mariana Islands House of Representatives and is currently coordinator for the NMI's Youth Congress. He served as an anchor, and for this episode that discusses several key moments and debates from the Northern Mariana Islands self-determination process of the 1960s and 70s, including the Marianas Political Status Commission's negotiations with the United States government to end their status as a U.S.-administered trust territory of the Pacific Islands. So through this, what ultimately became the Covenant Agreement, the Northern Marianas were ultimately able to establish the islands as a Commonwealth of the United States with greater rights, autonomy, and U.S. citizenship compared to what they had prior. So we were very lucky that LJ was able to sit down with the framers of the Covenant, the folks who really sort of crafted the current political status and engaged in these tough negotiations with a superpower. And this is tiny remote islands, right? Going up and making tough demands and saying, we want this, we demand this, and we're going to keep fighting you until we get it. So we get to hear from folks such as Vicente Naputi Santos and Pedro Tenorio, who have long careers in government and politics up in the Northern Mariana Islands. But at this point, for a clip that we're going to play, we'll hear from both of them, and they were just talking about times when they were just starting out in their careers as a member of the district legislature and an economist for the TTPI. So let's play the clip, and then I'll sort of give a quick, share my thoughts on it.
In 1963, the district legislature was created, and then from there on, we started to think what best to do with the economy and our people. And, well, we got something in our mind, an idea.
That idea was to end its status as a TTPI district and instead find a way to make the Northern Mariana Islands a permanent part of the United States. But how could this change in political status be accomplished? For many leaders in Saipan, the answer laid with their CHamoru cousins just 130 miles south.
Joining Guam would be the easiest way. Right next door, the people are all the same, pretty much related.
So, political leaders in Saipan pursued reunification with Guam as the most direct path to U.S. citizenship and economic prosperity.
Back then, Guam was already advanced. They have their own government, the so-called Organic Act, and they were already much advanced than Saipan. Their minimum wage is very good. They're making good money.
There was also a cultural aspect to the push for reunification, as it would once again bring the indigenous CHamoru people of Guam and the Northern Marianas under one government. After all, they share the same language and culture, and Guam is the southernmost island in the Mariana Archipelago. Their political separation in 1898 was not the will of the CHamoru's, but a result of foreign conflicts and treaties between Western colonizers. This factor helps explain the sizable support for reunification between Guam and the rest of the Mariana Islands. But it was not an opinion shared by everyone, and people worried about the unwelcome changes a new political status might bring.
First, it's not an easy endeavor because some people just don't like it to be part of the U.S. And they are afraid that they're going to lose their culture. And they're going to lose many things that so dear to them after many years of administration under the Spanish, German, and then the Japanese. And they're kind of just questioning, what's the benefit?
So, hopefully that clip gives a little bit of insight into the aspirations and the conflicts from different camps regarding the ultimately unsuccessful attempt to achieve political reunification with Guam. I mean, there were years of efforts, several referendums on the issue, but of course it ultimately didn't pan out that way. But that just gives a little sense of how messy of a process it was. It took many years with lots of disagreements and even threats of violence and an act of terrorism along the way. So I definitely encourage folks to listen to that episode, and you can get a sense just how complicated this process actually was and how amazing it is that the Northern Mariana Islands were able to make such huge demands of a superpower and get most of them.
I appreciate that. So we are edging closer and closer to our audience Q&A. There are just a few more questions that I have for our panelists, and this is a beautiful discussion here. And so to begin, what do the topics and stories featured in Memoirs Pasifika offer us in terms of understanding the current moment in Micronesian history and politics? And I will start with Vivian.
I think my experience with the episodes I've done is one thing we do is we link what I call generational history, whether it's the link between Cecilia Bomba and her son, George Bomba, who sort of picked up the mantle in terms of her advocacy for land claims and war reparations, or whether it's a generational history of one generation of activists and the current generation of activists. I think we ground the big news events in the lived experience and words of people, what moves them to action, what moves them to tears, to laughter, to rage. That's oftentimes not easily captured in news reports or academic papers. And we offer insightful and entertaining mental map, helping listeners to connect the dots between our local history and broader regional, national, and global movements, moments and movements.
Wonderful. And Bevacqua? Simegat?
So one thing that's really great about Memoirs Pasifika is that these every episode tackles something which people know about, right? But things change so quickly that while many people are hoping that one of these days somebody is going to write a book on one of these things, the truth of the matter is that if you want people to know this history and these issues, a podcast is a much better format for it. Because I hate to say it, as somebody who loves reading, and Dune, the new Dune movie came out, one of my favorite books of all time, making my kids read it. I mean, my kids are eagerly reading one of their father's favorite books. But for the next generations, there will be newer ways of getting information, of learning these things, right? And so we have to acknowledge that. And so what I love about Memoirs Pasifika is that it takes things that everyone knows about. Operation New Life, okay, but many people today don't actually know anything about Operation New Life unless you were alive at that time. Well, now here is an episode in which you can get something which is both bite-sized but also very easily digestible. And that's an amazing combo that podcasts can provide, is that it can be very in-depth but also very easily digested at the same time. And so really that what's being tackled in these episodes, it's great in terms of making the history that people should know about things that are around them, things that they might just mention randomly, right? But they don't know the story. And so this is a way that they can sort of get connected to that in a way that's much easier than sort of reading a book.
And let's hear from our producer, Tony.
Honestly, I think Vivian said a lot of what I wanted to say, but much better than I could have. So I'll keep it real short. I think a lot of it helps us understand the current moment in that we get to understand that a lot of our current struggles and strengths are rooted in long, ongoing efforts. These aren't just things that come out of nowhere. A lot of these issues have been with us and with communities throughout this region for decades, generations, right? And another thing I really like about it is what I've personally experienced with this is understanding just how many heroes we're surrounded by. I've been really impressed to meet people in the community who did a lot of really heavy lifting, and maybe don't get full credit for what they were able to do to help kind of move certain movements along in order to help pass laws or get recognition for a group. And so and a lot of these people are still with us. So I guess that's something that kind of stands out for me. And then also history repeats itself. I mean, you can listen to Operation New Life and then pick up a newspaper and look at what's happening with Afghanistan, and apparently there's still a potential that some refugees might wind up on Guam. And so there's a lot of questions to ask regarding these types of humanitarian efforts and whether it's truly fair to impose them upon a territory and what that means for the indigenous people and the land that is ultimately used for it. But then there's also the questions about, well, is this the right thing to do, And so it's not a clear-cut situation, but yeah.
For sure. Now, the legacies of academia and journalism in the Pacific often reproduce and trace the very dichotomies created by colonialism. To borrow a phrase from Dr. Vince Diaz, these processes create a distinction between who theorizes and who is theorized. When it comes to the programs you produce, what are some ways in which you ensure your media practice is reciprocal and even nuanced by Micronesian or Marianas contexts? And we will start with Miguel.
So, I mean, one of the main ways that I think all of us engage in that is that, and so as somebody who left academia, sort of left the University of Guam, one of the things that I always find unfortunate is that the production of knowledge is often shielded by academia, so that you use sort of the veneer of academia and scholarship to keep yourself less accountable to sort of the people that you are writing about. And so I find that sort of in Memoirs Pasifika and with Fanatsu and others, they're much closer to the communities. right? And that's something which traditionally makes things difficult for Indigenous people that are creating media within their own community, right? Is that the people you are talking about are your neighbors, your relatives. They're people that you are often connected to in some ways, right? But for me, I like that challenge because I don't think that I should be able to create something, an episode in which I get away with everything, in which I just got to do whatever I wanted, and no one said anything different, no one challenged anything. To me, that's not necessarily a successful thing, because if it's in the community, then you're going to have people who will respond to it. And so, so that's something that's important for me, is that it's always close to the community and that it can always help the community. So I think for Memoirs Pasifika, a lot of the episodes you can use in high school classes. You could use them absolutely at university classes. People who I know who have no formal education in college or anything like that, they love listening to them too. And so that's one of the ways that you can keep yourself accountable, is don't use academia as a shield to prevent people from reaching your content. Sort of open it up and make it so that they can embrace it and they can challenge it as well.
Then we'll move on to Vivian and then Tony.
It's a very complicated question, but for me, it always starts with acknowledging who I am, and that Guam is my home, but it's not the homeland of my ancestors, that I claim an identity as a Guam Filipina, not a Filipina American, and that my experience is imprinted with these dual colonization experiences of my homeland and my adopted home. I'm also not a media professional. And so I view my media practice as a way to go beyond the confines of the academia. And I see my media practice as an extension really of my work as an educator committed to a pedagogy of liberation, and as a social worker who looks at people and institutions from a strengths perspective. And you mentioned reciprocity, and for me, reciprocity is not a principle or a technique or something you have to do relative to a particular interview. Reciprocity for me is a value, and it's a network of relations that I live daily. My interviews with several of my guests comes out of years, decades of being across the table to them in different contexts and standing shoulder to shoulder with them and becoming a person that they trust with their stories. So I think always being a learner in these situations, presenting yourself as somebody who's learning and wanting to learn with them is very important. I think the creative process with the producer and mutual respect is incredibly key, because it's through that creative exchange with Tony as our producer, from conception of the idea to final edits and all the choices that we make along the way, that we produce these fresh and these new textured accounts of people making and living history.
Tony, you're muted.
I always do that. It's just my style. Okay. So, I really try to attempt to include as many local voices as possible. It's a way of holding myself accountable, and of course, based on the subject matter, that's inevitably going to happen. So but I really try to keep them involved throughout the entire process, and have a lot of phone conversations and email exchanges throughout the whole process, even sometimes after an episode is released, or if we're populating the website with somebody's photos, their personal photos, right, from their photo books and stuff. I want to make sure that they're involved in even the caption writing, or at least they approve what I come up with. And it's really just trying to get permission and participation at each step of the way, so that I never get too far in a process thinking that I'm okay with what I'm doing and find out later I've unfortunately offended or made some mistakes along the way. It's always kind of checking in, I guess. And always, I always want every episode to contextualize the larger narrative by including discussions on history of colonization and militarization for this region. I feel like if we're not incorporating that, we're really not actually telling the full story. Some folks listening might say, "Oh, well, you have an agenda, clearly." But I say to put those issues in your blinders is its own agenda, and that's actually sort of denying the reality of the situation. So that's something that I try to do. That I don't know if that's reciprocal, but it's definitely helps these stories be nuanced by a Mariana's or Micronesian context. And then, yeah, like Miguel was saying, this is something that's for the community, that's shared. It's out there for free online on podcast platforms. And then I'm happy to donate interviews, transcripts, anything that I've gathered, that we've gathered in the process to Mark. And I've told the folks over at Guampedia, if this is useful to you at all, use it free of charge, post it, So hopefully that's reciprocal, and hopefully people in the community feel like there's some value being added back.
Definitely. And if each of our panelists can briefly discuss how this platform called podcasting can help to censor Pacific Islander experiences and voices while advancing critical discussions.
Can I jump in here real quick, actually, to say that we're supposed to end at 9, but we started a little late and things took a little longer. So if anyone can only stay till 9, totally understand, but I do ask that you check your email later tonight or tomorrow. We're going to send out a link for an audience survey to fill out. That's something that's really important to the funders. We'll talk more about that later, but for anyone who has to log off now. And anyone, we can still have a short audience Q&A for anyone who wants to stay on, but don't worry, we won't be offended if anyone has to log off. Okay, I'm going to pass the mic to your question. Vivian.
Oh, okay, there you go.
Okay, so the sort of, say the question again, about the podcasting platform and
yes.
Center Pacific Islander voices and stuff. Well, I mean, so one of the great things sort of that podcasting allows, right, is that you don't need to have a lot of the things that we used to assume you needed to have to develop media, right? So for example, if in the past you felt that the Pacific Daily News had this terrible bias and it wasn't sort of getting, and it wasn't talking about the real issues, I mean, you could make flyers and pamphlets. Could you get investors to send you a newspaper printing press and then sort of get the facilities for it? It would be hard. It would be hard to sort of to challenge the authority of something like that, right? But the media landscape is flattening, right? And there's possibilities, there's risks, there's pratfalls to that, like as we see on social media, but at the same time, it does create opportunities. And so I think Pacific Islanders should actively embrace sort of these possibilities, because we don't need all of the economic and resource gatekeepers that used to be in place in order to tell our stories, right? And so we should definitely take advantage of that.
Vivian, do you have any thoughts about that? Oh, unmute.
I just really appreciate the opportunity that Tony has created to create a partnership like the one that I have with him. I mean, I'm a baby boomer, I'm kind of not a techie person. All this podcasting stuff for me was fascinating and something I really wanted to get into. But I wanted to work on the substantive, the relational, the creative stuff. I'm not that interested in the technical aspects, and I don't mind admitting that I need help. And I think being able to partner this way with older people who have so much to offer and so much to say, and stories that do need to be documented and preserved with the incredible technology available now. I think we're modeling something, I think, that is very important to be doing, so that it's not just about the older people listening to public radio and the young people doing all of the social media podcasting stuff. We have to find ways to reach across those generational divides and information literacy divides and share those stories together.
Wonderful.
I also don't mind admitting that I need some help with the technical stuff too, actually. But sorry, 1 second. I think you need to mute yours. Okay, sorry. Yeah, I'd like to sort of echo what Miguel said about regarding gatekeepers and how with the flattening of the media landscape really allows a diversity of voices. But again, he said it better than I could. So what I will say is that Memoirs Pasifika is just one of several podcasts out there exploring important and fascinating topics in Micronesia. And I'm just happy to contribute in a small way by creating a platform for people from these islands to share their histories and tell their stories. There are other, some other podcasts that I'd like to give a shout out to that I listen to and learn from. Of course, Fanatsu, there's One Micronesia, Deep Pacifica, for Micronesians, by Micronesians. There's a lot to dig into, and some of them really focus on different topics, and ours is very documentary style, deep history stuff, whereas those might be more conversational, really exploring things like identity, sexuality, customs, language, right? So I really recommend folks out there to check those out. Totally worth your time.
Wonderful, thank you. And so we are going to move right into our audience Q&A. Before we do, just another quick reminder to take a few moments to fill out your audience evaluation form. It really helps our funders and the producers of the show. And yeah, you can do this you must have received a Google form from the Memoirs Pasifika email. And if not, then I believe there is a link that is shared in the chat as well. And so going right into it, we have our first question from Selena Onadera Salas, who asks, they would like to hear the panelists share their experiences about how they approach, treat, or reconcile with the sacred nature of sharing our knowledge and our stories with strangers, especially among people of Micronesia. So who would like to jump on that first?
I can share some thoughts. I think so for me, for example, in the episode on Seafaring, there's a number of things that were shared that I did not put in the episode, right? They're shared because even navigators who have decided to share outside their circle, outside their family, their traditional roles, outside their islands, they don't share everything. Just like the way that a Surahanu, a Zoamti will teach just about anybody nowadays some things, but there's certain things that not everybody gets to learn, right? And so we have to, I'm totally comfortable taking that position in terms of this too. Now, it is part of the dialogue with those who you're talking to, and it is also a choice that you have to make in terms of how you represent. Right? How you represent sort of the stories you're covering, the people that are involved, their histories, their cultures, and so on. But I definitely think that that's part of it, is that you're curating it. You're deciding what is going to go out there, and there is power in choosing to hold certain things back. Right? That's why when people say, you know what Facebook needs? Facebook needs a CHamoru translator. So when you press translate, it'll tell you what somebody said in CHamoru. And I say, Mungadzu, no, I don't want that. Because then people will just use Google to translate CHamoru, and no one will want to learn the language anymore. And besides, I don't want Mark Zuckerberg knowing what I'm saying in CHamoru. I don't. So let us keep some things to ourselves, even as we welcome people to learn our stories. There's always things that we can share, but we always have to be willing and ready to keep some things sacred, some things to ourselves.
And Vivian, you sort of touched on this earlier. Do you have any other thoughts about that? Oh, sorry, you're on mute. But I saw your head shaking.
Yeah, I have nothing to add to what Miguel said. I think that was very well articulated.
Okay, wonderful. And Tony, I don't know if you have anything to say about that.
Same. And also in the role that I play, I'm often not making those decisions. I leave it a lot to the anchors to figure out exactly what goes into the story or not. And of course, I'm consulting, I'm advising along the way. But if somebody is of the opinion that something is sacred knowledge or needs to be addressed in a certain way, in a lot of ways, I'm sort of relying on an LJ or Vivian or Miguel to sort of help guide through that process. But I will say that, yeah, in the most recent episode about traditional navigators, it was definitely an interesting stuff to sort of figure out how to address, because there are certain questions that that I asked along the way, where some of our interviewees just said, "No, I don't want to answer that," and oh, okay, why? It's not for everybody, and okay, cool. You got to respect that.
Our next question. First of all, we have a few questions about sort of the creative process of podcasting and media creation, and so this first one is from Sean Gumatautau, who asks, can the panelists share their thoughts on the pros and cons of video versus audio podcast formats to reach new audiences? So I don't know if Tony, maybe you want to kick us off with that?
I would like to, but could you ask it one more time?
What are some of the pros and cons of video versus audio podcasts to reach new audiences?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. One thing is just pure accessibility. Even though it's becoming easier and easier to make documentary films more affordable compared to what it used to be like when you had to process film, and it's still a very expensive and laborious process. One thing that I like quite a lot about producing a podcast for the first time in my life is that it's actually a much quicker process, and I can release a full-length documentary almost every month. And if I was working in video, I would not be able to be that productive. I wouldn't be able to churn it out like that. And I think there's also just something so immersive about sound, and can really sort of pull you in, and you don't have to compete with the visuals. You can just listen. You can just try to hear the emotion in somebody's voice. You can just let those long pauses as they're gathering their thoughts or trying to find the right word become part of the story. I feel like sometimes it helps fill the gaps that video sometimes fills for us. And so in some ways it's a more engaging process.
Now, Vivian, coming from a public radio background and your experience there with Beyond the Fence, how would you respond to that question?
I mean, the process of production with this podcast compared to Beyond the Fence is a much more exhaustive and arduous one. I mean, the going back and forth in terms of the transcripts, selection of clips, and Tony can be quite a taskmaster in terms of the, how many times we have to redo the quality of a recording until we get it just right, and making sure that the ambient noise and background noises are being managed. I mean, I've learned a lot about that aspect of it, because compared to Beyond the Fence, we basically just sort of, cut and paste for technical shortening, as opposed to dealing with the quality of the audio. And I think I like the word immersive. I mean, I think it's the same reason why I like books over movies, right? it's being able to really immerse yourself in the voice and the words without the distraction of the visual. So for me, it's I like it, and I don't have to worry about what I look like when I'm doing it. So that's kind of a relief also.
Now, Miguel, yes, Fanatsu has sort of gone through a trajectory from audio to now live streamed video on Facebook. So how would you respond to that question?
So what's fascinating to me is that, is podcasts are still heavily driven with audio, even though there's lots of video podcasts now, or audio is the primary, video is secondary. But it's interesting because I think it is in some ways a response to the overstimulation and oversaturation of the world, is that there's always visual things happening around you. It's like Fahrenheit 451, it's like Blade Runner, it's like Minority Report, everything is being pumped into your eyeballs. So there is something calming about just listening to somebody, right? And perhaps there's something sort of very basic and primordial about it, right? Going back to when stories told over time would involve visual cues, but it wasn't a visual creation in front of you, right? It was mainly listening and giving yourself over to something. And so, yeah, that's why, for Fanatsu, for the pandemic, it was sort of live streaming on Facebook, but then there was a whole number of people who don't like to look at things while they enjoy podcasts. They just want to listen to it. They want to listen to it while they work out, while they drive, while they're lying down, right? And so that's why recently we just started putting them on Spotify and in audio forms only, just because there's so many people who want the content, but they don't like Facebook for obvious reasons. Who likes Facebook nowadays except for Mark Zuckerberg? And so second Mark Zuckerberg reference of the night. Let's see if I can get one more in before we end. But yes, so I think, but to echo what Tony said, absolutely, that podcasting is good because it can be intricate and deep, but you don't have to deal with the visual medium, which means it can be put out faster. And that's and that's a load off, when you're trying to tell stories. If you only have to worry about one sense primarily, much easier.
Now our next question comes from Maribel Kanata, who asks, what are some of the first steps in the creative process once you choose a topic like traditional navigation or historical events? So some of the first steps in the creative process after you've identified what it is that you want to produce a podcast about.
I would say some of the very first are really identifying who we can interview. And for some of these topics, that's also a question of who's still alive, who can we still find, and especially during COVID, who is willing to meet up with us, or can we record this interview through Zoom or Skype or something, right? But yeah, a lot of what we get, just because we come up with a topic doesn't necessarily, the beauty of a documentary is that much of it is written in the editing room. And it's not until you've done several interviews that you really have a sense of where the story's going. You might think you know where it's going when you first sit down, but once you start really pouring over the materials, you say, this is not the story we set out to tell. In fact, this is going all sorts of strange directions and lots of rabbit holes to go explore. But once we identify who's available to speak with and how they participated or experienced the topic in question, things start to fall into place, and then from there we can start exploring what types of archival material might exist out there that we can use for sound design to sort of supplement the storytelling. Yeah, that's what comes to mind for me.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, for me, I agree with what Tony said, that it really comes down to who you can talk to. And then also, depending on how much time you have, who is out there who you could have easy access to, right? Because there's so many stories that we could tell, but some stories will take more time because not everybody wants to talk, right? So for example, if I wanted to do a story about comfort women in Guam in World War II, that is an episode which would be almost impossible to do. Like, it's a story that should be told. Like, I would love it if somebody could do that, but a lot of the people have passed away. And even if there are people who experience that, or families who would be willing to talk about it, then you have to cultivate, then you have to build trust. And so that's why, you know, for these types of things, part of it is what is your capacity? You know, how much, and so that's why for me, for my 2 episodes, they were stories that I wanted to tell, and they were stories where I knew already who I wanted to talk to. And so Tony then says, hey, do you want to help me make a podcast? And I'm like, absolutely, por favor. Let's do this, because I got people I want to talk to. And this is a perfect example of how we can work together to create something that for your grant, for the wider community, for the world, but also at the same time, I get a chance to sit down and talk to people and ask the questions that I've been wanting, to tell a story that I've been hoping would be out there somehow.
And Vivian?
It's really a collaborative and iterative process with Tony. I mean, from the very beginning, I'm usually throwing out to him 3 ideas, and then we have to kind of wade through the 3 options. Generally speaking, though, in terms of the production, I mean, I have a lot of control over the selection of the interviews, the conduct of the interviews, the editing of the text. The part that I don't see really till the end, and this was especially true for episode 5 on marriage equality, is Tony's incorporation of the audio archival material. And in that episode, it was really quite marvelous. I mean, the way he put it together, it was almost like this really riveting Netflix documentary in terms of how it moved back and forth between the interviews and the archival material. It made for a very, very exciting narrative. But I didn't see that incorporation of the narrative until the last version. It was exciting.
Oh, yeah. I just want to echo too that Tony it's good to have Tony as the producer for this, because he brings a completely different perspective to things a lot of times. And so, you know, whether it's sort of, you know, being very diligent about checking facts, whether it is sort of thinking about how would somebody who's not from the region, sort of what would they need to know to understand this, and so on. And so, yeah, I'm glad that he is. I referred to him in the chat as the Stanley Kubrick of regional podcasts, and that's a film director who created great movies, but also could be overbearing at times. And so I definitely, we've had some long sessions where we've been recording narration, and I definitely felt like, what is it, Shelley Duvall, or wait, what is the woman from The Shining? And so, but it takes the quality to like a higher level. And so that's what I appreciate, because for me, I don't have a lot of time in Fanatsu and other things to deal with a lot of quality issues. So that's why it's, you know, it's kind of like a Cocinon Sanhizung, it's outside kitchen audio, it's outside kitchen sort of quality. But then but for Tony, he's trying to elevate it to a higher level. And I appreciate being around him doing that, because it also sort of, I learn skills, I learn sort of techniques. And so I appreciate that.
I really appreciate the kind words, and yeah, sorry that I put you guys through some abuse, but what I really meant to say at the top of this whole thing, and I really need to say now, is that there are some people who have not been named who deserve a lot of credit for Memoirs Pasifika, and that includes our intern, Annie Faye Camacho. She's been such a massive help with everything from designing the website to helping find archival materials for the website, to helping us out during recording narration and a million other things. And then Ryan Shook, who's our audio engineer, who has really done such a massive, he puts in a lot of work, and it really makes a massive difference. So Sizuas Mase to both of them, and couldn't do it without them. And they too contribute ideas and give some insight about how we could tell these stories a little bit different. And they're both born and raised from Guam, and so that they're also contributing in more ways than they get credit for or get paid for.
Our very last question comes from Juan Flores, who asks if you guys have any suggestions for using podcasts to support the enhancement of literacy in our schools. Memoirs Pasifika episodes support the oral traditions of islanders. How do we use that to build on more ways for young people to learn about and appreciate our rich history?
So I think, or Dispensazu, I'm happy to jump in. I think that in some ways, podcasts, although they do focus a lot on the audio, they can create, because part of this is just planting the seed of curiosity or interest, right? Because actually what you find is that somebody who listens to an episode that connects with them will then read a lot of things about it. That's what's amazing, is that if it connects with them, then they will be hungry for more resources that they can, so then they'll start Googling it, they'll look sort of on newspaper accounts. And so it's good that Tony includes archival information. But so in an educational context, you could absolutely pair podcasts with readings. And the podcast is actually, so unfortunately, there might be some who will just listen to it and not read it. But if it connects with them, then they will definitely read. And there'll be a synergy between that, right? There'll be a synergy between what they gained through one sense and then what they gained through another. And so I definitely think that in the future, this type of way of connecting with people, connecting with students in particular, it's going to be sort of more normalized. Sort of like, sort of if you're lecturing on a topic, then you say sort of, here's like a 20-minute podcast, and then here are readings associated with it. And the podcast can help inform the students sort of for the readings, so it's easier for them to engage with the ideas and the context involved.
Vivian, any thoughts on that? How podcasts can be used to support literacy?
No, I don't have anything to add.
And
Tony does.
I'm actually going to, LJ Castro is out there. I'm going to put him on the spot because he works as an educator in some capacities. He is the creative director of a dance troupe in Saipan, and he also is the coordinator for the Northern Mariana Islands Youth Congress, amongst many other things, like being an awesome radio show host. But I'm wondering if he would like to, since he anchored one of our episodes, I would like to give him the opportunity to weigh in on this question about how podcasts can be used as an educational tool in connecting with youth.
Oh, sorry, I didn't realize I had control to unmute my mic. Usually when you have these Zoom meetings, you sit down and be quiet until they tell you to talk. Sorry, but I do want to take the time to thank Tony for the opportunity to be a part of this program, because to be perfectly honest, when they mentioned to me that he was looking for anchors in regards to this project he was doing, I was like, you know, it was a first for me, just like it was for a lot of us that either sit on the panel or who are listening as members of the audience. I do believe that you know, as time progresses, you know, as sometimes as you know, as down home as we are, we have to progress with the times as well. You know, a lot of times when I do my meetings with either my dance students or with the senators who I work for, we have to use technology in that aspect, because, you know, to be quite honest, I've learned a lot, as a youth from, the progression of technology. And it's something that I definitely use a lot, even though I'm not as young as I feel at times. It's definitely a very useful tool. Now, with podcasts here, we do have a few podcasters. One of them actually so happens to be another unsung hero in the Memoirs Pasifika cast of characters, which is Brad Rosala. He does have a podcast as well. I do believe it's very beneficial nowadays, as social media seems to be very, 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 very big a lot of times in our everyday lives. So it's a very good tool to try to get points across, more so than, say, opinions. And in regards to, I hope I'm answering this question right, in regards to having it used for cultural purposes, even better. Because like what we do with the Crafting the Covenant episode, usually here we get that type of interaction if someone's able to call all the members of the commission, because out of, I don't know how many of them, there's only 4 still alive. If they're able to get them together to talk, and usually it's kind of bland, So what I realized with this format is that it kind of jump-started interest in learning about how the Commonwealth came to be, because even with the history of the Commonwealth, a lot of the people in our history book are actually still alive, at least about 30-40% of them. There's those stories that are documented. So to have have this medium where you can get the story behind the story, it's beneficial. I gotta admit, and it's also kind of helped in trying to understand each other. I mean, I'm about hundreds of miles north of all of you that are listening on this panel, and it's gotten me more in tune with learning about different stories I've heard of Guam, such as the Christmas in Vietnam trip. By the way, my parents have that record. The Operation New Life. I mean, I actually, as a congressman, one of the last legislations I wrote was a resolution honoring the late Monsignor Tiruguay. And that's where I kind of learned a lot about that program because he was at the forefront of it, and so forth. So I feel that, this is just like how the Lancero over at Tagualo tries to cultivate his tomatoes or his lettuce and so forth. We kind of need to, reinforce the benefits of stuff like this, where podcasts aren't just to talk about sports or stuff that's happening in the news. You could learn a little bit from it. I mean, I'm an anchor. I was put on as an anchor trying to educate people about a significant event in our history, and in turn, I learned something as well. So I really support what Tony's doing, and the partnership he's fostered between Humanities Guahan and our Humanities Council here, and I definitely encourage it. Sorry, I know I talk a lot, but what do you expect from a politician? But Jesus Mosi para Hamza Todos. Special shout out po si Dr. Sauder o Lili si Dr. Betances earlier kana jaja sa no. But I thank you for the opportunity, and I hope I was able to answer that question somewhere in between those periods of long wind.
All right, thank you, Senor. And thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our audience for sticking with us. We went a little bit over time, but we certainly appreciate all of you and your support. This was great. I really love what you guys are doing. I love that Memoirs Pasifika is so layered. Technically, with audio and the different elements, the different layers of sound, how you guys play with sound to create these very well-developed stories. I certainly appreciate the fact that we have a very rich history here in the Marianas and a lot of stories that need to be told. And certainly the many great things that have been done, even in our contemporary history, that we should definitely be embracing, and that we can be embracing with digital media. And so that concludes our discussion for tonight. If you haven't already, take some time to fill out your audience evaluation form, which you might have received as an email or through the link here in the chat. And that's it. I'm gonna sign off now. Thank you guys, and I'll pass it over to Lauren. Thank you so much.
Hafa-day, everyone. Thank you for joining our program today. Thank you for bearing with us through some of our technical difficulties. Sometimes computers just glitch up. But I hope you all could have just some time to fill out the survey. It won't take more than a few minutes. And if any of you are trying to fill out the survey right now, I'll be available here in the Zoom room with you in case you have any questions about it. It's the link in the chat that I just put there, or it's in your email inbox. And I promise everyone should have received it in their email already.